Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, the clock ticking to an end-of-month deadline for Greece to repay a 1.6 billion euro loan. We're talking about the growing prospect of a Grexit, a Greek exit from the Eurozone, with journalist Yanis Palaiologos, author of the 13th Labor of Hercules, inside the Greek crisis. He joins us from Athens. Welcome back as well to political researcher George Tsogopoulos. He's also in the Greek capital. With us here in the studio, our Europe editor Christophe Robit and Craig Kapitas, correspondent-at-large for Quartz and The Atlantic. In part one of our discussion, we talked about long-term debts to creditors and short-term. And this, I guess, was the big news ahead of that Eurozone group meeting in Luxembourg. The IMF saying a deadline's a deadline. It's not a European institution. Its debtors are worldwide. It can't make an exception for Greece. The fund wants its money by July 1st, or else it's a default. Managing Director Christine Lagarde says, by the way, you can start, Greeks, by having a second look at your pensions.
When it comes to Greece, there's been a lot of talk about the pension system. To us, it seems imperative that this system undergoes reform. The current system, with the timescale of contributions, with the options for early retirement, with monthly stipends that, at some levels, are comparable to German pensions, with more than 16% of Greece's GDP going towards pensions, we need to rethink that.
Yanis Palaiologos, what say you to that?
Well, the pension system in Greece, it's a very complicated issue. It was very, both economically unsustainable before the crisis and very unjust, because certain categories of workers had gotten a much better deal because they were better connected to politics. Now, since then, because of the huge recession and because of the PSI, the debt haircut of 2012, the insurance funds have lost tons of money. Many Greeks have lost a great part of their pensions. So any further move to deal with the pension issue has to take care not to hurt the low-income and even the middle-income pensioners. On the other hand, it is the case that 17% of GDP is spent by Greece on pensions, which is, I think, the highest level in the Eurozone. The state picks up 10% of GDP of that tab. So there are things that can be done which will both help it towards sustainability and will also be morally just.
All right, so there is that need to reform pensions. Christophe Robit, there was one analyst telling us what we may see, and you were mentioning in part one that the IMF shouldn't be a part of all of this right now. One analyst saying what we may see is the European Central Bank cover Greece's debts to the IMF.
Well, yeah, I think everybody agrees today that it was a mistake at the time to bring in the IMF. Now, it was done because a number of countries, not least Germany, wanted to cover their backs and use the authority and the experience of the IMF, because we don't have a European IMF. But we're talking about this as an economic story, but it is essentially, in my view, a political story. Greece leaving the Eurozone would be a disaster, not only for Greece, but for the Eurozone itself.
Why? Why would it be a disaster?
Well, different reasons. I mean, first of all, economically speaking, nobody can give us guarantees today that there won't be a risk of contagion.
Cascade effect.
Of course, look at the spread for Portugal and Spain. It has been rising steadily in recent days. And secondly, because the euro is a political project. You may think that Greece should never have joined the euro, and probably I would agree with you. But what belongs to the past belongs to the past. Greece is in the Eurozone, and I think the kind of message that you would be sending to the markets, that basically nothing is there to stay, nothing is granted, is a terrible one.
All right, you have an ally. His name is Jaron. He's on Twitter, and he says the markets would lose faith in the euro, and the Eurozone would crack at its edges politically as well. Too risky. But Craig Kapitas, I've heard many a Greek say it's time to go.
Well, I'm not one of them. I think Greece should stay in the Eurozone. But this really is in the hands of the Troika. And again, I think the question is very simple.
Can you make the IMF then go away?
Well, that's short-term kick-can thinking, IMF. I'm looking long-term here. The question really comes down to, one, how much do the creditors want their money back? The whole $340 billion, number one. Number two, can the creditors, can Europe, write off that entire debt and keep Greece in the European Union? I don't know the answer to that. The third point of this is Tsipras has the chutzpah, I'll use a Yiddish term instead of the Greek term, to go and ask Putin or the Chinese for the money. How bad do the creditors want their money? Now, believe me, I spent a long time in the Soviet Union and Russia as a correspondent, and there's a real close relationship between the Russians and the Greeks. And if push came to shove, I am sure that Putin would gladly put his hand in his pocket and come out with this 1.6 billion to keep all of these people happy for a few months. And it's the Russians who are going to reap the benefits of that, not the EU and certainly not Greece.
George Tsagopoulos, at this point in time, where do you stand on all of this?
Well, I hope Brexit will not happen. I agree with all speakers before. And I really do not see how Brexit will happen from the moment no one wants it. The creditors of Greece do not want it, Greece does not want it, and also other countries do not want it. The main problem with this discussion is that there is no precedent. So it's very difficult to anticipate what will happen in such a case. I mean, we have read so many articles about it, but practically the repercussions will be dramatic for Greece and for the Eurozone, because no one can be sure right now that the domino effect of the crisis, of the Greek crisis, will be stopped in the country, will not be spread in other countries.
But George, I'm coming back to what you were saying earlier about the sort of lack of confidence between those that are sitting down at the bargaining table, that Eurogroup meeting breaking up, and the chair of the Eurogroup, the Dutch finance minister, saying too little progress has been accomplished. There is no deal in sight. If they don't bring more to the table, when is the right moment to do so?
Well, we had expected that. I heard today the Chancellor Merkel speaking in the Bundestag, and she was saying that the Greek issue is not on the agenda of the new summit in Brussels, because she was waiting for the Eurozone result. From the moment the Eurozone result is negative, then the issue will be again discussed, if not during the weekend, for sure in the next summit. It seems to me that from the moment these leaders, the European leaders and the Greek Prime Minister, talk so often, this is an indication of the existence of political will that a solution will be found, because otherwise the consequences will be dramatic. I think that sure, time is running out, but on the other hand, we have a few days more for an agreement to be found.
All right, a few more days to be able to find an agreement, you say. There's no question, though, Christophe Robit, that that European summit, we've seen it before. It's going to be an all-nighter or a late-night meeting.
Yeah, there are some rumours that an EU summit might even take place on Sunday, because the clock is ticking, as you know. If it doesn't take place on Monday, then of course on Sunday or Monday, then of course this summit next week will be absolutely crucial. And I agree with George that the paradox of this story is that the fundamentals are there. The Greeks want to stay in the Eurozone. Merkel, Juncker, Hollande want Greece to stay in the Eurozone. But how do you get a deal? And I think for a deal to emerge, what needs to happen, in my view, is that Mr. Tsipras might be ready to agree to more cuts, further compromises, but he needs to bring home some sort of document where he has the assurances of Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Juncker that there will be debt relief. Without that, it will be political suicide for him. The other side of the coin is for Merkel to agree to debt relief, she needs to trust his government. And why is Mr. Tsipras in St. Petersburg tonight? I think he should be in Berlin, he should be in Paris, not in Russia, because Mr. Putin has very little to offer. And of course we can be very cynical. Everything that weakens Europe is good news for Mr. Putin, but I don't think that Russia is in a condition today to take care of this mess, because Russia has its own problems.
Oh yeah, but he, Russia has Putin can take 1.6 billion out of his back pocket and give it to Greece.
1.6 billion say Greece,
Yeah, but it kicks it down the road. It keeps the bankers and the troika and everyone off of his back for a little bit more. And you know as well as I do, Chris, that this kick the can down the road has been happening since the day Greece entered the EU. This has been going on for over a decade. It's not just 7 years.
Yanis Palaiologos?
Well, I should mention at this point that back in 2010, when Greece was on its way to its first bailout, and then Prime Minister Papandreou was traveling all over the world trying to seek alternative funding, he went to Russia and he had a meeting with Mr. Putin, who was a prime minister then, and he asked him whether Russia was willing to buy Greek bonds, and Mr. Putin changed the subject and started talking about armaments and whether Greece was willing to buy Russian armaments. So, I mean, this idea that he's willing and able to give money to Greece and replace its current official creditors, I think has been tried and has been shown not to be true. Now, as I wrote today in a piece in the Wall Street Journal, there is, despite the overheated rhetoric, there's a clear way out here. Syriza would be willing to accept, I think, even cuts that they find to be unreasonable, if there was this promise, a concrete promise of debt relief. And my newspaper, Kathimerini, reported today that there is a preparation of a statement between the ECB and the Commission for relating to further debt relief for Greece. So if all that can come together by the summit next week, then I think we can avoid a completely needless apocalyptic scenario, which would be horrible for Greece and very bad for Europe as well.
He just said the two magic words: debt relief. How much and how fast?
For debt relief, you need assurances that this government is a credible government and that they will put the house in order. And that is what is lacking at the moment.
Okay, interesting point in this conversation. I noticed it when you were speaking earlier, Christophe, that this discussion about how it's a negotiation between Europe and Greece quietly morphed into a conversation on how it's a negotiation between Merkel and Greece. And the German Chancellor, she spoke to the Bundestag this morning before this Eurogroup meeting. This morning, the Greek Prime Minister penned a column in Berlin's Tagesspiegel newspaper. There he rejected, quote, the myth that German taxpayers are paying Greek pensions and wages. German impatience with Athens growing. Listen, if you will, to the Social Democrat president of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, speaking at the start of the week.
We fully understand the Greek government's concerns about raising the value-added tax or the medical sector, or raising energy fees or lowering pensions. But I have no sympathy for their refusal to reform the pension structure, which is necessary. I think Mr. Varoufakis shouldn't be touring around Europe delivering big speeches, but rather should do his homework in Athens.
Christophe Rabit, on that score, we're seeing more and more the Social Democrats outspoken, backbenchers from the CDU outspoken. We're saying everybody wants Greece to stay in the Eurozone. Are we sure when it comes to Germany?
Look, I think it's not a story between Greece and Germany. A lot of countries are hiding behind Germany. Listen to what the Belgian finance minister said this morning, or the Irish finance minister. I'm not even mentioning the Portuguese and the Spanish, who've made tremendous efforts to clean their economy. I think it would be wrong to portray this as a standoff between Angela Merkel and Greece. There is a very strong consensus that what Mr. Tsipras has done so far has been, by and large, a waste of time. There is a lot of understanding for what's going on in Greece, but bringing in the same documents every day doesn't help.
When you have a negotiation and you know the deadline is June the 30th, you're not going to put all your cards on the table.
There is a lot of gesticulation on all sides, that is for sure. But
Chris raised this point. I mean, all the guests raised this point before. Does Greece have the political leadership that's sophisticated enough to deal with this? And the sidebar, that's the real important sidebar to this story. And I believe, or at least claim to believe, they don't. And I'm going to tell you why. The Greek diaspora community, Greek citizens who are part of the diaspora, such as myself, and I know a lot of them all over the world. And you ask the diaspora, no matter which generation left, why did you leave Greece? And they left because they all said there was no future, there was no way to do business. And then in the next breath, they will all tell you at the Greek Orthodox churches or at the AHEPA meetings or the Hellenic Council meetings in the United States, they will say, all the smart ones left.
A brain drain.
A brain drain, a classic brain drain that has been going on, well, according to my father, started in the late 19th century.
And that is precisely why I think that a lot of people have lost hope in Mr. Tsipras, is that when he was elected, and I was in Athens, there was a lot of hope that he could unleash some sort of ethical revolution, because he had a clear mandate to crack down on corruption, to make sure that the super rich pay their taxes. But that didn't happen, as we heard before, and that is partly the problem. I think that if Mr. Tsipras were serious about finding alternative solutions, other ways to raise money, his European partners would have listened, but we haven't seen that, and that's, I think, part of the problem. So Mr. Tsipras promised a lot, hasn't delivered, and meanwhile we're stuck in this complete deadlock.
George Tsogopoulos, Rome wasn't built in a day, neither was Athens. The Greek Prime Minister, could he still surprise us?
Yes, I think he can surprise us, but he has already made some steps which are very positive. I mean, the proposal the Greek government has already sent to the creditors mean that he is prepared to cooperate. So he needs now to make a few steps more. But we should bear in mind that he has already decided to make cuts and to raise the taxes with decisions which, in the period before the election of January, no one would even imagine about Mr. Tsipras, the Prime Minister. But
forgive me for getting back to this point, but what about defense spending? We know the Greeks per capita spend among the three or four most in Europe on defense spending, more than 2%. Isn't that where the cuts should be coming from?
Yes, this is a very complicated issue because Greece has a neighbor, which is Turkey, and also France and Germany has contributed in selling military equipment to Greece in previous years. So this issue is very, very complicated. Greece, of course, is not easily prepared to accept these cuts in the military budget. But in that regard, there is a reason, and this is a serious reason. And we can also link this discussion to NATO, and also what the US is asking the European countries to spend more than 2% of their GDP in defense. It is a very complicated issue, and in that regard, I agree that the Greek government itself is not prepared to accept that kind of cuts. Maybe a European defense or a European umbrella in the Greek problems vis-à-vis Turkey would provide the solution, but it's not the case right now. So Greece needs to be prepared, especially taking into account the stability in Turkey. I mean, this is an important parameter in the discussion.
All right, just a word, Christophe Robit, pack your bags. That Eurozone summit is going to take place Monday evening.
Monday will be in Brussels.
You said Sunday. You're only
Sunday, Monday, we weren't sure.
Okay.
Monday evening.
That news just coming in. Let me ask you, Yanis Paliologos, at this point in the day, when you look at the players in this, what do you see happening at that summit on Monday?
Well, I can only hope that cooler heads prevail. I mean, as George said earlier, there certainly have been significant concessions on the part of the Greek government since January and compared to its pre-election program. And that's why Mr. Tsipras feels that he can move no further and has been led to make some aggressive statements of late against the creditors and so on. Of course, the problem is that his pre-election manifesto was completely divorced from reality, and therefore, if there was going to be some kind of deal, he would have to move a long way towards the center. Now, the remaining differences are not that great. If there can be something on the debt, if the creditors can accept some of the administrative measures to combat tax evasion, and if the government can move on some of the pension issues, which are not going to hurt those who are less well off, then there can be a deal and we can all go and have a summer holiday instead of a bank holiday.
All right, summer holiday in Greece, let's hope. Christophe Rabid, final point on this. You know, this is coming on top of, and you were saying the peril for the Eurozone if ever there is a Greek exit. This is coming on top of a week where we've seen strains between France and Italy over migrants. We've seen, again, talk about this Brexit. This Europe that we have today compared to the one that you started covering when you became our Europe editor. What do you say?
It's in shambles, of course, and there are a lot of
shambles.
No, I mean, look. At the end of the day, look at do the British people really want to leave Europe? I don't think so. They want a better deal, and they probably will get it. Do the Greek people want to leave the Eurozone? No, they don't want to leave the Eurozone. Are we possibly able to say today that the solution to this migration crisis can come from somewhere else than Europe? No. So we need Europe. Europe is the solution, but it's under strain, as you said. These are very difficult times. I hope that we have the leadership in Brussels to deal with the problems. But at the end of the day, as we see, it's always among heads of state and government that the solutions are found.
How many zeros are they going to clip off the debt? That's what this is going to come down to.
All right, watch the numbers next Monday. Craig Kapidis, many thanks. I want to thank Christophe Rabid. Also want to thank for joining us from Athens, Yanis Palaiologos and George Tsokopoulos, Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Stay with us because we're going to talk about this more in our Media Watch segment. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois. So it's more front pages on Greece today for the 560th day this year. Greece can't pay and won't pay. That was the front page of The Guardian, just to pick one example. Elsewhere, we're seeing a lot of photos of Christine Lagarde as well on this one in terms of her, I suppose, laying down the law to Syriza's administration. Indeed, 30th of June. In other words, make further reforms to the pension system to get your deal. That's essentially, if you want to boil it down, what she was saying. And Alexis Tsipras replied, really, or at least anticipated what she was going to say, and replied in Der Tagesspiegel in the German press, saying that pensioners had become the main breadwinners in many Greek families, meaning cuts in pension payments would increase poverty, i.e., no thank you, Christine. So I suppose that all means, really, you could boil it down to Groundhog Day in dreary grey Luxembourg. I think it's a bit unfair to be calling Luxembourg dreary or grey, but Groundhog Day seems like a pretty accurate summation there by Bruno Waterfield on Twitter of what's going on. I'm not going to give a deep economic political analysis via tweet, so let's just stick to the slogans, Francois. Rearranging the deck chairs and ignoring the sinking is one slogan that's doing the rounds. There's this cartoon that was on the France 24 debate Facebook page earlier, the option between budget cuts and an exit of the Eurozone, or a little thimble full of ouzo. So I think that's
that's to help your decision making.
Right, indeed. Might be the best of the three options there. This is a British, Scottish MEP, Ian Duncan, posting this cartoon saying for him it's the best summary of #Grexit. We might need to get a closer look of that one, but that is the goldfish that have exited the bowl of water, which is on fire, which is impossible. Well, thank God we all made it out in time. Now, of course, we're equally screwed, they said very poetically, Francois. Now, I'm not sure if we have time for the editorial of Le Monde, which is moving from the Grexit debate to the Brexit debate, but worth looking at as well as we're talking about media. It's in English, and of course, it's the 200th anniversary of Waterloo, which that was one attempt by a previous administration, Napoleon's, to build a sort of European state, if you like. And
in his own way.
In his own way. François Hollande wasn't there to commemorate the Battle of Waterloo today.
No, he commemorated General de Gaulle's speech.
That's right. It's another
in 1940.
That's right, another 18th of June anniversary, I suppose. Today, we solemnly say to our friends across the channel, beware, says Le Monde, Brexit could be your Waterloo. So that's food for thought, François, as we look at various Brexit scenarios. And maybe there'll be an editorial of Le Monde in Greek sometime soon. Who knows?
We shall see. I'm waiting for it, and Craig Kapidis will no doubt be here to translate. I want to thank our panel once again. I want to thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.